Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime for today's Knowledge Bank. Today's session is going to be hosted by Matt Lewis from Commonhold and Leasehold Experts. Matt is going to be providing an overview of the draft Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill and the announcements that were released by the government on the 27th of January. The session is being recorded today and will be available to watch back for anyone that misses it and cannot join us live. And that is now all from me. I'm going to hand you straight over to Matt, so he can begin the webinar.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vicky. I appreciate you having me putting on today's talk. And thanks for everybody listening as well. And in particular, thanks in advance. And also thanks for your patience in listening on the updates. So Vicky's kindly introduced me, but for those that don't know, I'm a solicitor with CLE. I'm a director and co-founder of Leasehold Management Professionals LMP, and I'm one of the judges of the News on the Block's National Property Management Awards. I have a particular passion for raising standardship of residential developments, and in particular the leasehold and block and estate management space. And before I get going, I just wanted to deal with a bit of housekeeping. So for the purposes of today, we're going to be giving information only. We're not advising on specific circumstances. We're not advising, in particular, we're not advising anybody on the call or anybody listening back. And so please do not treat this as legal advice whatsoever. I'm a lawyer and nothing else. And so I will mention other things in passing, and really that's for the purposes of context. For example, I can't comment on certain parts of the reforms that impact on price, as that would be the work of a surveyor valuer, and we're just lawyers. And there are other parts of the reforms that relate to other professions that serve the block and estate management and leasehold space. Unfortunately, for the purposes of today, given the significant number of people on the call, we're not going to be hosting a Q&A. I'd really encourage listeners to continue to read in this space, to look online at others providing discussions, and to discuss matters with with those around you operating in the same space. And I'd really encourage, as will be discussed later in the talk, responding to the relevant consultations that impact you and providing your thoughts, as this is a good opportunity to have your say. If you've got any feedback for the purposes of this talk or any of the services being provided by News on the Block, please do let Vicky know, as this is particularly helpful for shaping future talks moving forward. I'm known for GIFs, moving images in presentations. For those that have listened to me give legal updates in the past, I'm sad to say that I won't have any GIFs for you today, unfortunately. These circumstances are such that it's not necessarily overly appropriate for me to introduce GIFs in the talk, but I'll save those for another talk in the future. So, what are we going to be looking at today? Before we consider the context of the announcements last week, we're going to have a look at the other reforms that we've seen, those that have been yet to be implemented, the status of those, and other reforms on the periphery relating to the block and estate management space. We'll have a quick look at the general legislative process, the lawmaking process, and in particular, we'll look at this in the context of and in the context of the Commonhold Bill that we have in draft from last week. We'll look at other relevant reforms on the periphery, as I say, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some key policy areas with a view to giving some context to these proposed reforms that we have before us. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with next steps. I suspect all in all, I'll be done before the hour. And as for the reasons I've explained, we're not going to be doing Q&A today. That may leave you with some time back in your calendar, but we'll see how we get on. So, for those of you that have listened to a reform update before, you'll have seen this diagram. I always start here as it's particularly helpful to understand the lawmaking process. I appreciate that this will be overly simplistic for some people on the call, but it's particularly important, in my view, to understand the context of the latest announcements alongside the context of the current provisions that we have in force and those that we have which are subject to further consultation or commencement. So for the purposes of that context, we are at the very end of this diagram for the purposes of LAFRA. And so we'll come on to this in a moment, but parts of LAFRA have been introduced with the passing of that piece of law, and other parts of LAFRA have yet to be introduced in law because they require further consultation or commencement as applicable. And notably, by comparison, for the purposes of the Commonhold Bill, we are at the very start of this diagram. And so we are in this consultation phase for the purposes of the consultation and the abolition of leasehold interests moving forward. And you'll see later in the process that the bill itself is placed before Parliament. And then throughout the legislative journey, the bill could change. A good example of this is how LAFRA, during its course through the lawmaking process, changed in content and shape. And in addition, we saw this with the Building Safety Act. Another really good example of this is what happened in the renters' rights space with the passing of the Renters' Rights Act through Parliament. So it's really important in context to understand that with the Commonhold Bill announced last week, that we're really at the very start of the journey in terms of the lawmaking process. So where are we first when it comes to LAFRA? So on the screen now, you'll see a diagram, generally speaking, of the headline points in LAFRA. With the leasehold house ban, you'll see that we're waiting a consultation. With enfranchisement, this being the entitlement to a lease extension or a new lease on the same terms, but with an extended term and a reduced rent, and with enfranchisement collectively getting together and purchasing your freehold. The slide says not yet in force, consultation awaited, and A1P1 case ongoing. That's not perhaps entirely true because there is one exception to that in that the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act removed a requirement of a 2-year ownership of a flat before a leaseholder could commence a lease extension claim. And that's passed into law in January of last year. And so from that point onwards, leaseholders don't have to wait to have owned their property for more than 2 years before they can extend their lease. Significantly, the right to manage provisions were brought in the spring of last year, early in the spring of last year, that being to relax the eligibility criteria and increase eligibility for mixed use developments, and to reduce and only really in rare circumstances for leaseholders to pay costs associated with their claims on right to manage. Then we haven't seen any movement in terms of the ground rent buyout, which is an option in LAFRA. There was a significant consultation on service charges mid last year, and we're awaiting secondary legislation in that respect. As for estate charges, we're waiting for outcome of consultations, and the consultation is currently in process in that respect until March of this year, and so there's still time to reply in that respect. And then further provisions of LAFRA being the ombudsman scheme, the rent charges and building safety, you'll see are dealt with on that slide. In addition to those things featuring on the slide, there was also provisions within LAFRA dealing with inquiries on a sale of a leasehold interest, or more typically known as LPE1 inquiries, and we've yet to hear further in that respect as to when they might be introduced also. So moving on to the meat on the bones for the purposes of today, and really this talk is about the Commonhold Bill for the purposes of the announcements last week. The Commonhold Bill in draft says to do four things. And so what's in the bill is, at a headline point, attending to Commonhold management and conversion. Then, in addition, there is a proposal to ban the sale or the grant of leasehold interests for the purposes of flats moving forward. And then one that caught the headlines by reference to the amendment of the Ground Rent Act of 2022 was to phase out existing ground rents by capping existing ground rents at a flat rate of £250 per annum, and then reverting those to a peppercorn after 40 years. And then finally, the abolition of forfeiture, the removal of forfeiture as an option for lease enforcement, and replacing it with a different enforcement regime for lease breaches that really looks to balance the interests of homeowners and landlords. And this really looks to deal with the perceived evil in leasehold forfeiture, the threat of a windfall, and really the value of the leasehold interest reverting to the landlord, irrespective of the size or the financial value of the breach in question. Notably, for those that have been watching this space for some time, the things that were not included within the bill were those on the slide. And so we saw in the service charge consultation last year a discussion of mandatory qualifications for managing agents. And that consultation has now closed, and we're awaiting the outcome of that consultation. In addition, there were further service charge reforms to add to those that feature in LAFRA, which were discussed in the service charge consultation of last year, and those don't feature. There's also the provisions regarding the adoption of freehold estates, which I'll come on to shortly. And then there were a whole host of Law Commission recommendations in the three very large sets of reporting in 2020 on Commonhold, right to manage, and leasehold enfranchisement. And so those things don't feature either. As for other relevant forms, before we delve into key policy areas, and not necessarily on our radar for the purposes of today, but important to note, somewhat on the periphery, are the reforms which are likely to hit the leasehold, block and estate management space on screen. And so we've seen the introduction of the Renters' Rights Act, and there are within the Renters' Rights Act two sets of provisions which are likely to impact on the block and estate management space on screen. There are other things which may impact also, but significantly the provisions dealing with decent home standards and how this may interplay within the service charge arrangements that we see in leases, along with obligations that we see in leases that might differ from those obligations in the Renters' Rights Act. And in addition, the Housing Act trap, catching leases that have ground rents in excess of £250 outside of London, and in excess of £1,000 inside London, and attracting the complexity associated with those ground rents unattractive for leaseholders. Those things were dealt with by the Renters' Rights Act, which is important to note for the purposes of lease extensions, deeds of variation, and enfranchisement. In addition, there is a conversation regarding a remediation bill in 2026, alongside the government's remediation acceleration plan, which I'll touch on later in a tiny bit of detail. There's also the net zero provisions, again, similarly to the decent home standards. Important to note these increasing standards associated with developments and the interplay that that might have with leasehold provisions and leasehold responsibilities in leases. And then finally, broadband upgrades. And in that respect, there is an outstanding consultation which ends in a few weeks' time. So moving on to the impacted areas and trying to really stitch this together for you. First, we're going to look at enfranchisement. And so what I mean by enfranchisement here is really buying the freehold or a lease extension of a house or flats or a block of flats. And the provisions that are relevant to this in the reform agenda are part 2 of LAFRA, and this looks to the valuation, the legal costs, and also other provisions which are impacted by that part. In addition, there is part 3 of LAFRA, which gives leaseholders, when implemented, a right to buy out their ground rents as an alternative option to having to do so as part of a lease extension if lease length is not a problem for them. And obviously, we've seen, for the purposes of the announcement last week, the ground rents cap in part 3 of the Commonhold bill, which, as I say, is to cap existing ground rents at £250 per annum, and to do so by reference to the Ground Rent Act of 2022, and then those existing ground rents to phase out to a peppercorn, i.e. nothing at all, after 40 years. In addition, as alluded to earlier, there is ongoing judicial review proceedings in the court whereby interested parties have brought proceedings to challenge the reforms in LAFRA insofar as they relate to the price that is payable for a lease extension or to enfranchise, to buy out the freehold and any other interests, along with the legal costs parts to LAFRA, which are to reduce the extent to which leaseholders are pay towards a landlord's costs when they exercise claims. And that litigation is ongoing. We saw an outcome of that litigation in the High Court last year, and we're told that litigation is ongoing. So that's important to have in mind when considering the timing of implementation of these provisions. Significantly, at the end of this slide, you'll see that we're awaiting consultation on the relevant ingredients or rates for the purposes of the valuation of a lease extension, along with the valuation of a freehold interest and other interests that leaseholders have to buy when they enfranchise. And we're unsure as to when that will arrive, along with those provisions in LAFRA relating to legal costs. As to ground rents, I've already mentioned the Housing Act trap and the fix to the Housing Act trap in Section 31 to the Renters' Rights Act. But just to add to what I've mentioned already in that respect, and to recap, In brief, there is a problem in the Housing Act that catches long leases, perhaps an unintended consequence of the Housing Act that catches long leases within a regime for assured tenancies. And this causes difficulty for leaseholders in mortgage lending associated with their ground rents. And it has created uh, uh, circumstances where, on sale of leasehold interests, leaseholders seek deeds of variation to deal with this issue. This issue was fixed by Section 31 of the Renters' Rights Act in 2025. And so this is no longer a consideration in those circumstances. That said, there still exists the ground rent to consider for leaseholders when they come to sell or remortgage, and those uh, those those considerations are impacted by the proposed reforms that we've discussed. Um, the next point to mention is that some value for some valuers on the call is the consideration of these reforms on potential rates now and whether or not exercising claims now is cheaper in light of these announcements. I'll just put that one out there. Um, and then in the future, the two things that will impact this space are the possibility of a cheaper lease extension in LAFRA or ground rent buyout in LAFRA, and also the capping of rents, which I've discussed already on this call in the Commonhold bill. And subject to all of this becoming law, we've obviously got on the periphery the litigation that I've mentioned, the judicial review proceedings. As for service charges and estate charges, I deal with this on the current slide. So this space is affected by a number of provisions in LAFRA, and so for flats, as has been mentioned already, there are proposed reforms for service charges in Part 4 of of LAFRA, and these deal with increased transparency for leaseholders when it comes to service charge spending, a proposal of an annual report that needs to be provided to leaseholders, conformity in terms of service charge budgeting and service charge accounting. And then there are provisions in Part 5 of LAFRA dealing with the same or similar for the purposes of houses. Part 6, there will be a mandatory ombudsman scheme for leasehold interests. And then I've put as Roman numeral 4 the possibility of further changes to the Commonhold bill, noting earlier the point that I mentioned regarding the possibility of the Commonhold bill changing as it passes through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and noting earlier the consultation of mid last year on service charges. The things that are outstanding in that respect are further service charge reforms on service charges. For example, in that consultation on service charges, there was commentary on a revised or an adaptation to the Section 20 consultation process. In addition, there was discussion regarding mandatory reserve funds. There was discussion regarding mandatory asset management plans or planned maintenance plans for the long term. In addition, there were these provisions or discussions regarding mandatory qualifications for managing agents. None of this currently features within the Commonhold bill, but could be things that may feature as the bill passes through Parliament depending upon the appetite of that. Um, a lot of the focus on these reforms is greater transparency, improved rights to challenge, and as I say, the possibility of the regulation of managing agents. Um, the as to the greater transparency, if somebody on the call wants to read further in this space, then I would suggest revisiting the consultation on service charges of mid last year. In addition to the greater transparency points, Roman numeral 2 on the focus point, the point here is the part of LAFRA that deals with legal costs and the rebalancing of legal costs in litigation, and that's worth keeping an eye on. This is somewhat on the periphery at the moment, but in December of last year, the government released a consultation document entitled Reducing the Prevalence of Private Estate Management Arrangements. Consultation looked at tackling the growing issue of unadopted amenities on privately managed housing estates, where the roads, the drainage systems, green spaces, and other communal infrastructure are maintained by private estate management companies rather than public authorities. It said in the document that this tends to lead to unfair charges, poor transparency, and limited homeowner rights, creating significant consumer detriment. A few points of note that feature on the slide. Proposals in this consultation are to strengthen or mandate adoption on these unadopted estates. But significantly, this doesn't appear to, at least on first reaction, deal with the adoption of existing estates. So that's one thing to look out for. And consultation on this is open. And so you can respond on this if you are impacted by this by the 12th of March this year. As for Commonhold, as I say, the Commonhold bill that was released in draft last week looks at doing a few things. So in part 2, there is a proposal to ban the granting of new leases of flats, and this is being consulted on. And the time frame for applying to this is the 24th of April of this year. Part 1 of the draft bill looks at management, and in particular, all of those topics which were discussed in the Law Commission's historic reporting entitled Reinvigorating Hold in 2020. The recommendations of the Law Commission, some of you on the call will be familiar with, but many of those feature within the draft bill, such as the historic perceived problems with Commonhold that we have in the 2002 Act. And so the things that feature within part 1 are things such as the opportunities to redevelopment rights within existing Commonholds, introducing sections whereby there are different parts of complex modern estates, perhaps mixed-use estates, where there are different interests on the Commonhold development, enabling those interested parties to vote on things that impact their sections. For example, if you own a Commonhold interest within one block and it's a flat, then you may have an interest in the management of the estate as a section, but also the management of your block as a section. In addition, part 1 looks at introducing different heads of costs or schedules of costs that we're familiar with in leasehold property currently for the purposes of Commonhold contributions, or what we know at the moment to be service charge costs. In addition, there are provisions allowing for leases in Commonhold arrangements where applicable. Um, there is a significant amount of work on the Commonhold community statement, along with how local rules are used and how decisions are made, amending those. There is provision for appointing and replacing directors. There are mandatory provisions relating to insurance. There are mechanics for agreeing budgeting, recommended by the Law Commission, as I say, and this looks at advanced agreement of budgeting before an accounting period, and then framework for when a budget cannot be agreed. There are provisions relating to reserve funds and how those are catered for. There are provisions dealing with emergencies and how these are dealt with outside of the usual accounting and budgeting for the purposes of contributions. There are provisions dealing with dispute resolution and how disputes are handled in a Commonhold arrangement, along with provisions dealing with enforcement of Commonhold contributions so as to preserve the solvency of the Commonhold arrangement. And then there are other provisions on the periphery dealing with minority owners' protections in terms of decision making, and in particular, amendment to the Commonhold community statement and local rules alongside those provisions. And then there are finally provisions dealing with buying and selling Commonhold interests. And then perhaps for those lawyers on the call, there are interesting provisions dealing with registration and how land registration works for Commonhold interests. There are also provisions dealing with membership of the Commonhold Association, interests in a Commonhold unit, and how one may enlarge a Commonhold in relevant circumstances. And then finally, for the purposes of this slide, there are proposals within the bill for an improved process for converting from leasehold to Commonhold. And then there are provisions within the bill dealing with the phasing out of residential leaseholds in a converted Commonhold building. And for those lawyers on the call that have been grappling with that recommendation of the Law Commission for some time, that will be interesting reading. Again, looking at particular policy areas, building safety. And so somewhat on the periphery for the purposes of this talk, but important to note for completeness, in April of this year, we see the commencement of the residential personal emergency evacuation plans. These being new regulations to improve the fire safety for disabled and vulnerable people in high-rise and high-risk residential buildings. And so property managers on the call will be familiar with those and will be looking to implement those provisions in their practices as we speak. Again, as mentioned earlier on the call, there is a proposal to introduce a remediation bill as part of the government's remediation acceleration plan to force the remediation of buildings requiring that, and then a framework for enforcement of those obligations. And then finally, the ministry has confirmed that they will be reviewing Building Safety Act provisions in 2027 in a statement on the slide. As for disputes, I mentioned earlier, but we're awaiting consultation and commencement on the legal costs provisions in LAFRA. In LAFRA, there are provisions which are intended to rebalance the legal costs arrangement associated with disputes, that being where there are proceedings in the court or tribunal, and the landlord is looking to recover their costs as against a leaseholder. There are provisions requiring determination or an order of a court or tribunal before such costs are payable. And there are provisions enabling a leaseholder to claim costs in any such proceedings, subject to an order of the court or tribunal. As I say, we're awaiting consultation or commencement on those. I've discussed already, but there is a proposal in the draft bill of last week to replace forfeiture and replace it with a new regime to remove the evil associated with forfeiture, being the windfall. There are interesting provisions there in the draft bill dealing with what disputes are caught by those provisions and what disputes perhaps are not caught by those provisions by way of breaches of lease provisions. And so the lawyers on the call will be interested in reading those in some detail because those will impact on the process that is adopted in the future for the purposes of lease breaches. And then there are proposals to transfer powers associated with such disputes in the leasehold and block and estate management space to the First Tier Tribunal in England and the Leasehold Valuation Tribunal in Wales, where those disputes perhaps may be caught by the courts at the moment in the current regime. You'll be pleased to hear we're getting there. As for next steps for you, getting involved now involves responding to consultations. Consultations will continue to come thick and fast in this space, I'm sure, but the ones that we have live at the moment are ones on broadband upgrades associated with leaseholders, and that closes in a few weeks' time. We've got the consultation on estate charges associated with houses, which closes in March. We've got the mandatory estate adoption consultation, which I just discussed earlier, which again closes in March. And then we've got the consultation on the banning of leaseholds for new flats as part of the emergence of the reinvigorated Commonhold, which closes in April. In addition, you'll see on the slide, there's a suggestion from me to write to the ministry on the draft bill if you've got any views on the draft bill. And I really would encourage that for those on the call that have a working understanding of how this plays out in the real world. And if you, in particular, if you have any concerns about proposals in that respect. Somewhat back to my earlier slide, which deals with lawmaking process, what to look out for this year. Currently predicted in mid-May, we're going to see a King's Speech. At that point, we may see our Commonhold bill start its formal lawmaking process in the House of Commons. Once it's finished in the House of Commons, it will work its way to the Lords, and then it will pass Parliament if it does, and we'll obviously need to keep a careful eye on what it looks like throughout that process. We'll see further consultation on LAFRA, I'm sure. Those things have been mentioned throughout this talk, so keep an eye out for that. It may be that we see consultations on the other reforms that we have discussed on the periphery on this talk. And then finally, we'll obviously need to keep a careful eye on the judicial review proceedings dealing with the challenges to LAFRA, in particular, those challenges relating to the correct price payable for a leaseholder to enfranchise, the legal costs that they pay when they enfranchise, and how that might impact on the proposed reforms in that respect moving forward. And here's a little diagram as to all of those things that might be happening shortly. And that is all from me for the purposes of today. As I say, we don't have time for Q&A, particularly given the number of people on the call. Uh, as I expected, we have finished ever so slightly early on the overall hour. Um, I'd like to wish you a good day. Thanks for your patience in listening. And just to reiterate my opening remarks, thanks ever so much, Vicky, for putting on today's talk, and all at News on the Block for having me. Thank you.
No, thank you, Matt. Thanks for putting this all together and hosting so quickly, so shortly after the announcements. There is just one question here, not necessarily a question, but Anna was asking if you could share the link to the consultation that you mentioned, for the adoption of existing freehold estates. So yeah, I can try and get that from Matt for you, Anna, and then I will pass that on, to you via email. Otherwise, thank you again, Matt, so much. Thank you to everyone that's joined us today. And as I mentioned, the webinar has been recorded. So if anyone would like to watch it back just to go over anything, you'll be able to do that on the News on the Block YouTube channel. Otherwise, thank you again, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Matt. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.